Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud and I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in central London in private practice. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Gil Greengross, who is an evolutionary psychologist and an anthropologist. He's a postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University in Montreal in Canada. And we're going to be discussing today the psychology of comedy and comedians. And Gil is basically a kind of world expert, really, on this subject. And I want to kick off by talking to Gil about the latest study to come out on this subject, a study just published in the International Journal of Cardiology, which has found that the funnier you were as a comedian, as rated on a scale, the shorter your life was. Basically, the funniest comedians were found in this study, which comes from the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, Australia. The funnier comedians were found to have the shorter lives. So first of all, Gil, what about this finding? Did this come as a surprise to you, or from your own research and your own experience, you figured this was likely to be the case?
Oh, hi, Raj, and thanks for having me in your podcast. No, the finding is not very surprising to me, and my research also not directly tackles this question, but other research is very congruent with the result that they found there. So basically, there is some other research that show that comedians and funny people in general, like comedy writer, tend to die slightly earlier than the average in the population. Also, we are not exactly sure why that might be, but I can maybe talk a little bit about it if you would like.
Yes, tell us a bit about the theories as to why that might be.
Well, first of all, there is a lot of variation, of course, in this phenomena. So there are some comedians that die very early, others stay are alive for a very long time, like Mel Brooks, Woody Allen. So even though we are talking about averages, it's important to recognize that there are a lot of individual differences. And one of the reasons that people think that comedians die earlier, it's related to their lifestyle. So many comedians use drugs, don't have the healthiest lifestyles. They tend to drink a lot, overeat, celebrate, go to parties, and that in general doesn't bode well for a long life.
But this particular study, which was done by Dr. Simon Stewart and Dr. David Thompson, in a way went into greater depth than just this notion that if you're a funny person or a professional comedian, it might have some kind of impact on your longevity, because they were classifying comedians into whether they were very funny or only moderately funny. And they looked in particular, and I thought this was very interesting, at comedy duos, like where there's normally a straight man and a very funny person. And in British comedy, and the study focused on British comedians, famous examples include Ronnie Barker, who died at 76, while his straight man, Ronnie Corbett, is still alive and now past 84 years old. And other famous examples are Eric Morecambe and Eric Wise. And Morecambe died many years before Wise, and Morecambe was meant to be the funnier one, and Wise the straight one. So there was something about this idea that very funny comedians, that had something to do with their personality, and that may have something to do with lifestyle choices. What are your thoughts about that idea?
Okay, so first of all, what they did in the study, they went to a website that ranked, I think it was the top 50 or 100 most famous British and Irish comedians, if I'm
that's right.
remembering correct.
That's right.
Yeah, so just by itself, it's important to recognize that most, if not all of the comedians there are quite famous and funny by their own. Now, what the researchers did, they ranked the comedians from 1 to 100 and to find some differences between them. And I think there is something into the fact that maybe the funniest comedians are maybe dying earlier, and one of the thing is that they might live more intense life. And there is another study that recently also was published that is sort of compatible to this finding, that find that comedians tend to have more psychotic traits, or trait that might be an indication of bipolar personality. It's not that they are themselves bipolar or schizophrenic, but they tend to have some traits or some tendency to have traits that are in other people lead to being to having all sort of a psychotic disorder. And I think that that's really, it's not only maybe comedians, it's very creative people tend to live a very intense life, both in real life and also inside their head. Their creative output, a lot of time, they have like bouts of energy that they work hard and make all these wonderful comedy films or comedy routines, but then sometimes after a while they get depressed, they're not that creative, and this sort of a bipolar personality, even though they're not really diagnosed like that, might lead eventually to a shorter lifespan.
Now, you yourself have done a lot of research in this area, and I suspect maybe of all psychologists in the world, you may be the person who's done the most research in this subject. Now, you published a study recently with Jeffrey Miller from the University of New Mexico, where you compared the personalities of professional stand-up comedians with amateur comedians, humor writers, and college students. And you came up with some very intriguing findings, and the study was published in the journal Personality and Individual Differences. Some very intriguing and surprising findings. For example, you argued that comedians suffer from, well, maybe suffer is the wrong word, but have a personality type that can be described as impulsive disinhibition. And this impulsive disinhibition was crucial to their comedic skills, but may also explain a high-risk lifestyle that could be dangerous in terms of leading to a shorter life. Could you say something about that?
Right. So first of all, what we gave comedians and the other group that you mentioned is a very common psychology test or questionnaire that measures personality on 5 dimensions. So one of the dimensions is the openness to experiences, and we found out that comedians score really high on this dimension, and this is something that might be expected. When you're very creative like comedians, you have to be open to new ideas, and this is part of the creative process, and also as you mentioned, they have maybe more disinhibitions. They have to think about some weird ideas, and who are the best people to think about it, people that have no boundaries. On the other hand, what we also found was something that was very surprising to us, and that was that comedians were very introverted in their personality. Now, one would expect, based on what they see comedians do on stage, that they will have a very extroverted personality. And the two things don't necessarily contradict each other, because it's very possible that on stage they are very extroverted, but in real life they need to have some balance. And a lot of them are very introverted, and that helps them for the career, because you have to remember that most of the time comedians are not performing on stage. So they have to manage their careers, they have to be creative, they have to write their own material, to practice it, and all of these things usually, especially in comedy lives, it's done when they're all by themselves. It's a very solitary profession. You rarely work with others. Maybe groups like Monty Pythons and others do when we become very famous, and you do TV shows and movies. But the life of stand-up comedians is a life of someone that go on the road, travel a lot, have to perform many times every week in a different place, and that's might fit better introverted personality. And the other thing is that many comedians also told us they feel that this is a way for them to express themselves. So even though they might be introverted in real life, on stage they can be whatever they want. So they, loosen up, don't have any inhibition. They can portray any personality that they would like to be, or just imaginary one, and that's the whole fun that they have in comedy.
But I thought this was a really, really fascinating finding. And the trouble with psychology, by and large, is that it's very difficult to come up with findings that are counterintuitive. A lot of people who are not psychologists hear about a research finding and say, well, you could have guessed that. It's just common sense. But here is an example, I think, of psychology at its best, where it comes up with the opposite finding than you'd expect if you didn't know a bit of psychology. And I also think it suggests something quite important about comedians, which is I think that they're putting on an act. In a way, they're compensating for their introverted personalities, and they're putting on an act as a way of making their way in the world. I also think that if they're naturally introverts, life becomes a bit of a torture to them because of their persona on stage means that everyone they bump into expects them to be extrovert when they're not really. And that may be a key source of stress for them in their personal lives. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, well, several thoughts I have about that. So first of all, you're right. A lot of people come to stand-up comedians and ask them, tell me a joke, be funny, do something funny. And some of them go along with that, like Robin Williams actually was one of the people that did it, but a lot of comedians don't like it because when they are off stage, they are just different personality. And one of the things that you sort of mentioned, and I think it's very important, they do put an act on stage. And what people don't realize a lot of time is that most of the things that you hear on stage is script. It's not that a comedian come like spontaneously with what they have to say on the moment. Also, it does happen sometime, but most, I would say 80-90% of the act is well rehearsed. Sometimes the order is different, so they need to get like they change maybe the way they do stuff on stage or based on the crowd reaction and so on. But they're well prepared to perform. Now the other thing is that it's very important that you also mentioned that I think it's very important that it's a way for comedian to gain something else from the life. And I did a study, one part of my study with the comedian was to try to understand why comedians become comedian in the first place. And I tried to track if they had some unusual experiences with their parents. Was it like the old sort of cliche is that comedians are depressed, and that they had like bad relationship with their parents, and they have all sort of conflicts or a problem with their parents. So in order to compensate, they go into comedy. And I actually was quite surprised with this finding that I didn't find any evidence for that. So the relationship with their parents was very routine and very normal compared to a control group that we had. But what was interesting when we sort of dig more into their childhood experiences, when they grew up, when they, especially around maybe adolescence years, comedians seem to be acting more and more as class clowns. So they were sort of the odd men out. They were the one that running pranks on friends and teachers. And it seems to me, and this is kind of my interpretation because we don't have yet a good data on that, that it's one way for them maybe to compensate on some disadvantages that they had in life. Maybe they're not the best looking individual. Maybe they can't find mates as easy as others. So comedy is a sort of a route for them to gain some status among friends. And I think this is something that carries well into their adulthood. And comedians in general, I think they are considered to be of high prestige job. People like them, people want to be around them. So there are lots of benefits of being a successful comedians. And I think that's what the allure of people that go into this business have.
Now, another thing that you've done in the past is you looked at this notion of different kinds of styles of humor, and the relationship between that and comedians. Could you say something about different styles of humor and what you found in terms of the implications of that?
Right. So there is one questionnaire that measure both positive and negative styles of humor. And positive styles will be a kind of humor that just telling joke with your friends, using humor just to as a positive outlook at life, just something very benign and friendly. Negative aspects of humor is humor that is used to disparage others, to put down others. Sometimes even self-deprecating humor is considered a negative style because you make fun of yourself. So using humor more as to bully others, something that is used in a mean way. And to some surprise, also I wasn't completely surprised, I found out in my research that comedians scored very high on all types of humor. So they were high in both like positive styles and negative styles. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because humor in general consumes such a large portion of their life that they will be it's activated in their brain all the time. So that's why we get all these different styles. And as comedians, they also need sort of to navigate between the different styles, because it's fine to use both negative and positive style, but you don't want to use, for example, too much negativity, especially toward others or toward the crowd, because it can turn the crowd against you. And this is at large, it tells us something interesting about humor, that humor is a very important social phenomena. And the people that use humor, that are trying to make others laugh, they must be very sensitive to the crowd's reactions in order to be funny. So it's not like you can't memorize 1,000 jokes. That doesn't make you someone with a great sense of humor. You have to know what to say in the right moment in order to be funny, and that's something that comedians probably are better than most other people.
Now, another phenomenon that's very interesting about comedy and the profession of comedians is this massive gender bias there is, which is that, generally speaking, wherever you look in the world of comedy, the ratio of successful men making a career in comedy compared to women is like 9 to 1 or 10 to 1. And you have some very interesting theories coming out of evolutionary psychology to explain this phenomenon.
Right. So this is, I would start by saying that this is, of course, a very complex phenomena, and there are all sorts of explanation as to why there are so few comedians. And you're right. There's about 90% male comedians to 10% female comedians. Now, it does not mean, as some people interpret it, that women are not funny. It just means that there is some bias here towards male in the business, and that could be both cultural and evolutionary, as I suggested. So let's maybe talk first about some cultural constraints that limiting the maybe existence of large number of women in the comedy. So as I mentioned earlier, comedians travel a lot, and they do so mostly by themselves. So this kind of lifestyle fits much better stand-up comedians like male than females, especially if a woman has a family. It's really hard to travel a lot. And in order to be a successful comedian, you cannot just perform in your local club. You have to go to many diverse places to sharpen your skills. Now, there is some sexist views against women still. As there's Christopher Hitchens famously say that women are not funny, and that's a sentiment that some people still think, even so there is no like base for this claim in general. But the evolutionary explanation is based on the fact that a humor, as a lot of other creative and cognitive ability, is used as a signal to to for mate quality. So people that are very intelligent, people that have a lot of creative ability, that are funny, they have better genes in general. And if you want to pass it to the next generation, then one good way is to mate with these individuals. Now, in reality, what happened, like with many other mammals, there is disparity in parental investment between males and females. So females undertake the heavier cost of reproduction. They are the one that get pregnant. They are the one that to have to breastfeed. They have limited reproductive span, while males can technically have sex with a lot of women and have many more kids that women could potentially have in life. So what all this makes women more choosier than males. And one thing that they use, so there are many cues that women and also male use to find a mate, is sense of humor. And there are studies that are showing, because humor is a sign of intelligence and it's possibly a sign of underlying genetic quality, so that's a cue that a lot of people seek. But because women are the choosiest sex, they pay more attention to that. So in studies, we find out that when men and women talk that they want someone with a sense of humor, they mean slightly different things. So men want someone that will laugh at their jokes, while women want someone that will make them laugh. And going back to comedy, so that fits perfectly well into the theory that as to why are they just so few female comedians, because it fits much more to male psychology. As I said before, comedy is quite a prestigious job. People that go to a comedy club and enjoy it, they love the comedians, and that's an opportunity for male to get a lot of casual sex, one night stand. And then I talk with many comedians, also it's more anecdotal, we don't have hard data to support it, but from conversations with many comedians, we know that many of them use these opportunities to have sex with women from the crowd or in the city where they travel. And because they travel a lot, so that fits perfectly to male psychology, while it doesn't fit very well to female psychology. So in that sense, this is one reason that men might want to get into comedy, and in general, it's considered to be a very high status profession, and we know that high status translate into mating success for men.
See, what I think you're saying, and another way of putting what you're saying is that evolutionary psychology would predict that men would be more driven to persist at the job of making others laugh, because it's got a very strong, much stronger biological imperative for them in terms of passing on their genes. And
Right.
in a very precarious and difficult profession like comedy, because they're more driven and they're more persistent, you're going to get more men surviving at the end. There'll be a massive culling, where a lot of people just don't make it. Whereas women won't have the same persistent drive. They'll have a persistent drive to operate in other areas, but not to the same level in comedy. And that explains why you're not going to get so many women. Would you go along with that way of putting it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And the one thing to remember is that comedy is very competitive field. I mean, we tend to go to comedy club, or if you go to comedy club or see watch sitcoms and go to comedy movies, but there are literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, aspiring comedians that never make it. So it's very competitive job. And male in nature tend to be more competitive than women. And another thing is it's very unpredictable profession. You can be funny today, like some of the great comedians of all time were very funny in some period of time, but after a few years, it just fade out, and people didn't like that style of comedy. So you have a lot of insecurity in the job. And in lower level comedian, if you are doing comedy as a routine, you can only be sure that maybe in the next few months, maybe in the next year, you have job security and people, club manager are going to hire you, but you never know what's going to be down the road. And you have to work very hard to maintain this kind of level of competitiveness and success. So women don't like it as much as male, don't want to go into the profession that has such a job insecurity. They prefer to go to safer jobs, and that's what happened at the end. So there is some sort of self-selection into the comedy business.
So, Gil, I find the research that you've done on this subject, really fascinating. But why is comedy a fit subject for scientific investigation in the way that you've devoted quite a lot of work to? Why should psychologists study comedy? My own view would be that humor is extremely important. We know that humor leads to bonding. And one of the reasons why politicians want to get humor into their speeches is because it has a big persuasive impact on voters. So humor from that standpoint is hugely important in terms of its impact on human psychology and persuasiveness, and we tend to like people who can make us laugh. But maybe there's another reason why science should take comedy seriously.
Oh, well, comedy might be one end of humor, as you mentioned. So at large, you're right. Humor is very important phenomena, and it has implication in almost any field that you will study has like some part that humor can contribute to it. So culturally, we can learn about the culture by looking at what make people laugh at that culture. Developmentally, we can learn about how kids and baby progress based on their sense of humor, of level of understanding of humor they have. It's very important cue in mating, as I mentioned before. It's also a very huge social phenomenon. People like being around people that are funny. It's an icebreaker. So there are many implications. We use humor every day. People don't notice how often we laugh during the day. And a lot of time it's not in response to joke. We each has their own things that make them laugh. A lot of time it's in response to mundane comments, but it's just such a huge part of human condition that we must study it. And unfortunately, not a lot of psychologists and social scientists agree on that. And comedy in general, stand-up comedy is maybe one end of this in understanding humor, and I think we can learn a lot about humor or any other phenomena by trying to understand how the extreme works, how people with extreme ability work, what that can illuminate a lot of questions about the people themselves, but also on humor. It's related, of course, to creativity. We want to learn more about creativity, so it's what's better than to learn from the expert that actually performing that. And that's the other thing. If we want to learn about humor and what make people laugh, it's best to study the people that are very good in making other people laugh, and they have great insights into humor that a lot of times psychologists just tend to ignore.
But this is the other intriguing thing. It's such a massive part of human life, human social life, and yet the amount of research that psychologists or psychology as a discipline have devoted to it is relatively small, almost minuscule, you could say. Is it the case that academic psychology looks down its nose a bit at the psychology of humor or the psychology of comedy, and that if you yourself had chosen to specialize in the psychology of schizophrenia, let's say, or attribution theory, that would have been more helpful career-wise than to focus on the psychology of humor.
Yeah, in fact, I actually had professors telling me, don't go into studying humor. It's not a good move for your career. Nobody will want to hire you in academia. That's boring topic, it's too mundane, and you're right. People and social scientists in general, psychologists in particular, for decades, if not centuries, tended to focus on the negative aspects of life, like mental disease, depression, schizophrenia. They wanted to improve lives by understanding maybe the extreme bad condition that people are suffering from. But in the past, I would say like 10, 15 years, there is a shift, especially with the rise of the positive psychology movement, that look into positive emotion. So for a long time, people consider positive emotion as just something pretty mundane. They can't tell us anything about life. There's nothing interesting about them. They can't really improve life. But nowadays, we have a better understanding about wellness and health, and we know that keeping a positive outlook of life, keeping a healthy lifestyle that include also having like humor in your life can actually have some good contribution to your life, both physically and mentally. So that's, again, that's another aspect that why to study humor, that it might benefit you physically and mentally, and there is a lot of research on this subject.
But there's another reason why maybe people shy away a bit, not just psychologists, professional psychologists, but the lay public from reading about or trying to understand at a more scientific and profound level phenomena like humor, in the sense that they think it's just going to kill it for them. That if they read about the academic study of humor, they're just not going to find stuff funny anymore because they're going to be analyzing it too much. And of course, famously, Freud wrote a very unfunny book, the title of which was something like Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious, where he tried to psychoanalytically analyze humor. So I'm just wondering about your own relationship to humor. Do you still find jokes funny? Do you go to comedy stores? Or are you too now analytic about humor to lose yourself in it?
No, not at all. I'm very fond of jokes and humor. I try to immerse myself in as much humor in my life, and I go to comedy clubs. I just love it. So I don't see that there is a discrepancy between the two. And as my advisor, Rod Martin, another famous humor researcher, said, it's like if you're a sex researcher, you don't expect to get an orgasm every time that you study humor, right? Study sex or read about sex. And this is the same with humor. I mean, you can treat it as a serious academic endeavor that we can say some meaningful things about humor, but we can still enjoy it. And I just heard John Cleese recently, and another comedian told me similar thing, that they themselves actually can't laugh at other people's jokes anymore because they have seen almost every variation of humor possible in their lifetime. So in a sense, that takes something out of their enjoyment of humor if you are professional humorist. But maybe luckily for me, I am not planning to have any career as a stand-up comedian, so I can still do research and enjoy comedy at the same time.
Gil Greengross, thank you very much indeed. And you can read Gil Greengross's blog on Psychology Today and follow his academic research by following some of the links from his very fascinating blog indeed. Gil, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.